On the morning of October 27, 2022, workers at Dubai's Mina Rashid Marina arrived at their usual time to perform routine maintenance on one of the world's most luxurious superyachts. They carried buckets of specialized cleaning solutions, paintbrushes, and polishing equipment up the gangway of the Madame Goo, a 325-foot floating palace with a jewel blue hull that gleamed in the Arabian sun. The men worked carefully, methodically, maintaining every inch of the vessel's aluminum rails and teak decks in pristine condition. To any observer, this was just another day of ordinary yacht maintenance in one of the world's premier superyacht destinations. But there was nothing ordinary about this scene. Every worker who stepped aboard that morning was, technically speaking, violating United States law. Every dollar spent on paint and cleaning supplies represented a potential breach of international sanctions. And the yacht they were so carefully maintaining was, according to the United States Department of Justice, stolen property that should have been seized months earlier. The Madame Goo doesn't just sit in Dubai Harbor, it hides there in plain sight, protected by a diplomatic shield that has turned an American ally into a fortress for Russian wealth. At $156 million, this feed ship-built masterpiece represents everything the United States has tried and failed to accomplish in its campaign to punish Russian oligarchs for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Its owner, Andrei Vladimirovich Skok, is a billionaire member of Russia's parliament who the U.S. Treasury Department claims has long-standing ties to Russian organized criminal groups. Its location, the United Arab Emirates, is supposed to be one of America's closest partners in the Middle East. And its status, nearly 4 years after sanctions were first imposed, remains completely untouched, a monument to the limits of American power and the willingness of even friendly nations to shelter blood money when it comes with the right price tag. This is the story of how a steel magnate with alleged connections to one of Russia's most brutal crime syndicates built a fortune in the chaos of Soviet collapse, how he hid that fortune in one of the world's most extravagant yachts, and how that yacht became the centerpiece of a diplomatic crisis that reveals just how difficult it is to actually seize the toys of oligarchs when they're smart enough to park them in the right place. It's a story about money, power, and the art of disappearing while everyone watches. Andrei Skok was born on January 30th, 1966, into a Soviet Union that was already beginning to crumble. His father, Vladimir Skok, would prove instrumental in his rise. But in those early years, the family was relatively ordinary by Soviet standards. What set Andrei apart was his timing. He came of age just as Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms were tearing apart the planned economy, creating opportunities for those ruthless enough and connected enough to grab them. By the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union dissolved into chaos, young men like Skok were positioning themselves to profit from the greatest fire sale in human history. State-owned factories, mines, and industrial complexes were being sold off for pennies on the dollar in a privatization process that created more billionaires faster than any economic event in recorded history. But getting rich in 1990s, Russia wasn't just about having money to invest. It was about having protection. The Russian mafia had evolved from prison gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises that controlled entire sectors of the economy. In Moscow, the Solntsevskaya Bratva, named after the Solntsevo district where it originated, had become the most powerful organized crime group in the country. According to U.S. Treasury Department documents filed in April 2018, Andrei Skok was one of the leaders of the Solntsevo criminal group during this period. The designation states explicitly that he had long-standing ties to Russian organized criminal groups and spent time as a key figure in an organization that would eventually control everything from drug trafficking to political assassinations across Russia and beyond. Skok has always denied these allegations. His lawyers have called them baseless, but the U.S. government's case is built on more than rumor. Intelligence reports, financial forensics, and testimony from Russian law enforcement paint a picture of a young man who understood that in the new Russia, you couldn't separate legitimate business from organized crime because there was no line between them. The people who got rich weren't the honest entrepreneurs. They were the ones who could protect their investments with violence, who could navigate the complex world of protection rackets. And corrupt officials, who understood that every contract needed to be backed by the implicit threat of force. By the late 1990s, Skos had transformed himself from alleged gangster into legitimate businessman, at least on paper. He invested heavily in Metallo Invest, a metals and mining conglomerate that would become one of the world's largest producers of iron ore and steel. His timing was impeccable. Russia's natural resources were about to become spectacularly valuable as the global economy boomed and China's appetite for raw materials exploded. But Skok made a calculated decision that would define his strategy for decades. He transferred his 30% stake in Metallo Invest to his father, Vladimir, in 1999. Officially, Andrei owned nothing. Unofficially, everyone knew the fortune was his. That same year, 1999, Andrei Skok was elected to the State Duma, the lower house of Russia's parliament, representing the Belgorod region. He has held that seat continuously for 27 years, making him one of the longest-serving members of the United Russia Party, Vladimir Putin's political machine. His role in the Duma has been consistent and unwavering. He votes as the Kremlin instructs. In February 2022, when the Duma passed a resolution asking Putin to recognize the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, Skok voted yes. Days later, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine and the world changed. But by then, Skok had already taken precautions. He'd spent years building a financial fortress designed to survive sanctions. His assets were held in offshore companies registered in places like Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and the Seychelles. His business partner, Alisher Usmanov, one of Russia's richest men, controlled Metallo Invest through a web of corporate structures so complex that even prosecutors struggle to map them. And Skok's personal toys, the visible manifestations of his wealth, were registered under shell companies that bore no trace of his name. This included his private Airbus A319 jet, worth $90 million, and his crown jewel, the Madame Goo. The yacht was commissioned in 2013 from Feedship, the legendary Dutch shipyard that has built more superyachts for billionaires than any other builder in the world. Feedship doesn't discuss clients or prices, but industry experts estimate that a yacht of Madame Goo's size and complexity would have cost between $120 million and $150 million to build. Skok spared no expense. He hired Winch Design, one of the most prestigious yacht design firms in the world, to handle both the interior and exterior. Andrew Winch's team created what they described in promotional materials as a yacht of feminine proportions, graceful and statuesque, yet stealthy and fast. The exterior featured clean lines and a distinctive blue hull that made the yacht instantly recognizable. The interior was a masterpiece of understated luxury, avoiding the gaudy, gold-plated excess that characterized many Russian oligarch yachts in favor of a more sophisticated aesthetic. At 99 meters, Madame Goo was the largest yacht ever built in the Netherlands when she was delivered. Her statistics read like the specifications of a small cruise ship. 12 guests could be accommodated in 6 suites, each designed with VIP-level luxury. The master stateroom occupied an entire deck, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a private study, and a bathroom larger than most people's bedrooms. 5 additional guest cabins provided accommodation that would shame most 5-star hotels. But what truly set Madame Goo apart was her crew capacity. 36 crew members, housed in 18 cabins, meant that every guest was attended to by 3 dedicated staff. This wasn't just luxury, this was the kind of service usually reserved for heads of state. The yacht's technical specifications were equally impressive. 4 MTU engines provided a combined 14,401 kilowatts of power, giving Madame Goo a top speed of 24 knots and a cruising speed of 16 knots. Her range exceeded 5,000 nautical miles, meaning she could cross the Atlantic without refueling. A helipad on the sun deck allowed guests to arrive and depart by helicopter, avoiding the inconvenience of actually traveling to a port. An elevator connected all decks, ensuring that even moving between floors didn't require the indignity of climbing stairs. The Beach Club, a feature becoming standard on large yachts, provided direct access to the water, with a tender garage that could accommodate multiple smaller boats for ferrying guests to shore or pulling them on water skis. But the real cost of Madame Goo wasn't in the construction. It was in the operation. Industry standards suggest that a yacht of this size costs approximately 10 to 15% of its value annually to maintain. For a $156 million vessel, that translates to $15.6 million every year, just to keep her floating and functional. That figure includes crew salaries, which for 36 people range from $60,000 for junior deckhands to $300,000 or more for the captain, totaling between $1.8 million and $2.5 million annually. Fuel costs add another $2 to $3 million per year. Insurance, assuming you can get it, runs about $1 million. Dockage fees at premium marinas like Mina Rashid start at $500,000 annually. And maintenance, the endless battle against salt water and tropical sun, consumes another $5 million, including the $1 million just for repainting the hull every few years. These costs meant that Skok was spending more than $42,000 every single day just to own Madame Goo. Put another way, every hour the yacht existed cost him $1,750, whether it was being used or sitting empty at a dock. But for a man worth $8.7 billion, these were rounding errors. Skok's fortune generated enough passive income that he could fund the yacht's operations with less than a week of investment returns. For the first 9 years of her life, Madame Goo sailed the Mediterranean in relative anonymity. She was spotted at the usual playgrounds of the ultra-wealthy, Antibes, Monaco, Ibiza, Sardinia. Her crew maintained her in immaculate condition. Her guests, whose identities Skok carefully protected, enjoyed the kind of privacy that only unlimited wealth can buy. There were no scandals, no incidents, no attention. This was exactly how Skok wanted it. Unlike some Russian oligarchs who seemed to relish attention, Skok understood that the best way to protect wealth was to avoid becoming a target. But on February 24, 2022, that strategy failed. Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, and within days, the United States and European Union began imposing the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever directed at a single country. Russian banks were cut off from the SWIFT international payment system. Russian oligarchs found their assets frozen across Europe and America, and superyachts, those floating symbols of kleptocratic wealth, became priority targets. Task Force Kleptocapture, a special unit of the U.S. Department of Justice, was established on February 26th with a single mission: identify, freeze, and seize the assets of sanctioned Russian oligarchs. Within weeks, yachts began falling. On April 4th, Spanish authorities seized the Tango, an $87 million yacht belonging to Victor Vekselberg in Palma de Mallorca. On May 5th, authorities in Fiji seized the Amadea, a 348-foot monster worth $325 million and allegedly owned by Suleiman Karimov. By June, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain had impounded dozens of vessels with a combined value exceeding $4 billion. The message was clear. If you supported Putin, if you benefited from his regime, your toys were forfeit. But Andrei Skosh had seen this coming. While other oligarchs scrambled to move their yachts to safe harbors, Skosh had already made his move. On March 25, 2022, exactly 1 month after the invasion began, Madame Gou sailed into Port Rashid in Dubai and dropped anchor. The timing was perfect. The UAE, one of America's most important allies in the Middle East, had declined to join Western sanctions against Russia. The Emirates leaders had calculated that their economic interests lay in maintaining good relations with Moscow, particularly as Russian money poured into Dubai's real estate market and Russian tourists filled its hotels. For oligarchs, Dubai offered everything: no sanctions enforcement, no risk of seizure, and a lifestyle of luxury that rivaled anything in Europe. Skoch wasn't alone. The Madame Gou was joined at Mina Rashid Marina by several other sanctioned vessels. Motor Yacht A, a $300 million behemoth owned by fertilizer magnate Andrei Melnichenko, was spotted tucked into a creek in Ras Al Khaimah, another Emirati port. The Nirvana, worth $300 million and owned by Vladimir Potanin, Russia's richest man, sailed into Dubai just days after Potanin was sanctioned. The pattern was unmistakable. Dubai had become the safe house for Putin's elite. The location Skok chose for his yacht was symbolically perfect. Mina Rashid Marina is one of Dubai's most prestigious waterfront developments, a complex that includes luxury apartments, restaurants, shops, and the crown jewel, the permanently moored QE2, the famous transatlantic ocean liner that now serves as a floating hotel. The presence of this British maritime icon, transformed into a tourist attraction, provided a kind of cover. Mina Rashid was portrayed as a legitimate marina serving all manner of vessels. What harm could there be in one more superyacht? But the U.S. government saw it differently. In April 2018, years before the Ukraine invasion, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control had placed Andrei Skoch on its sanctions list. The designation cited his position as a Duma deputy and, more damningly, alleged that he had long-standing ties to Russian organized criminal groups. The language was unusually direct for a sanctions designation. Typically, Treasury uses diplomatic phrasing, citing generic connections to the Russian government. But with Skoch, they went further, effectively calling him a mobster-turned-politician. At the time, that designation meant Skoch's U.S.-based assets were frozen, and American citizens and companies were prohibited from doing business with him. But it didn't affect his yacht, which operated under a Cayman Islands flag and was owned, on paper, by a company that bore no direct link to Skoch. For 4 years, Madame Gou sailed freely, her true ownership hidden behind the corporate veil that protects so much oligarch wealth. That changed on June 23, 2022. The Treasury Department issued a new designation, this time targeting the yacht itself. Madame Gou was declared blocked property, meaning that any transaction involving the vessel using U.S. dollars, any service provided by U.S. companies, any employment of U.S. citizens was now illegal. The designation effectively cut the yacht off from the global maritime industry, which operates primarily in dollars and relies heavily on American companies for everything from insurance to navigation systems. The move was part of a broader strategy. Between February and August 2022, the U.S. sanctioned more than 1,000 individuals and entities connected to Russia. But yachts were special targets. They were visible, they were valuable, and most importantly, they were humiliating. Few things damage an oligarch's reputation more than having his floating palace seized and put up for auction. Task Force Kleptocapture understood this psychology. Every yacht they grabbed was both a financial blow and a public humiliation. But designating the yacht and seizing it were two very different things. In December 2022, according to sources familiar with the investigation, The Justice Department began taking steps toward actual seizure of Madame Gu. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, the same office that had successfully seized the Amadea and several other yachts, began building a case. The legal theory was straightforward. Skok was sanctioned. The yacht was his property. Therefore, the yacht was forfeitable under federal law. Any dollar transaction related to the yacht's operation constituted money laundering and sanctions evasion. The U.S. could seize it wherever it was found. The problem was jurisdiction. Madame Gu wasn't in international waters. It was in Dubai, a sovereign nation, and the UAE was making clear it had no intention of helping. When Deputy Treasury Secretary Wali Adeyemo, one of the architects of the Russia sanctions strategy, traveled to Dubai to pressure Emirati officials, he was met with polite refusals. The UAE issued carefully worded statements about taking their obligations under international law seriously and implementing sanctions in accordance with UAE regulations. But no action was taken. No assets were frozen. No yachts were seized. For the United States, this represented a significant diplomatic problem. The UAE hosts critical American military installations, including Al Dhafra Air Base, which houses thousands of U.S. Air Force personnel and serves as a hub for operations across the Middle East. The two countries have deep intelligence sharing relationships. American defense contractors sell billions of dollars in weapons to the emirate every year. Threatening that relationship over a yacht seemed disproportionate, but allowing Russian oligarchs to shelter their wealth in an allied country undermined the entire sanctions regime. The diplomatic dance became increasingly awkward. In public, U.S. officials praised UAE cooperation while noting areas for improvement. In private, they expressed frustration that bordered on anger. A Western official involved in sanctions enforcement told reporters that Dubai had become a black hole for Russian money, a place where oligarchs could park assets without fear of seizure. The official estimated that $30 billion in Russian wealth had flowed into Dubai real estate alone since the invasion began, with billions more hidden in yachts, private jets, and offshore accounts. The UAE's calculation was coldly pragmatic. Russian money was good for business. Wealthy Russians were buying penthouses in Dubai Marina and villas on the Palm Jumeirah. They were opening bank accounts, starting companies, and spending freely in the Emirates' luxury shops and restaurants. After nearly a decade of economic stagnation following the collapse of oil prices, Dubai was booming again, and Russian cash was a significant driver. Why would the UAE sacrifice that growth to help enforce American sanctions against a country with which the Emirates maintained good relations? Moreover, the UAE had its own concerns about the precedent. If Dubai cooperated with U.S. seizures of Russian assets today, would China demand the same cooperation with seizures of Taiwanese assets tomorrow? Would Saudi Arabia expect help seizing Qatari property in some future dispute? By maintaining strict neutrality, the UAE positioned itself as a safe haven, not just for Russians, but for wealth from anywhere that might be threatened by sanctions. It was a carefully calculated position that maximized Dubai's attractiveness as a financial center while minimizing political risk. For Andrei Skok, this diplomatic standoff was a perfect outcome. His yacht remained in pristine condition, his crew paid and working, his lifestyle uninterrupted. The sanctions designation was an inconvenience, requiring him to avoid U.S. companies and dollar transactions. But Russia's banking system had developed alternatives. Payments could be made in rubles, yuan, or through cryptocurrency. Supplies could be sourced from Asian and Middle Eastern vendors who didn't care about American sanctions. The yacht's operations continued as if nothing had changed. And indeed, for observers at Mina Rashid Marina, nothing appeared to have changed. On that October morning in 2022, and on countless mornings since, workers continued their routine maintenance. Paint touched up here, wood polished there, systems checked and rechecked. The yacht remained a showpiece, her blue hull reflecting the Dubai sun, her decks immaculate, her crew ready for guests at a moment's notice. Nearby, tourists posed for photographs with the QE2 in the background, unaware that they were also capturing one of the most significant symbols of sanctions evasion in modern history. The parallels between the two vessels were striking. The QE2, once the pride of British maritime engineering, now served as a hotel, her glory days behind her, but her elegance preserved. Madame Gu, the pride of a Russian oligarch with alleged ties to organized crime, continued to function exactly as designed, protected by the same neutral harbor. Both represented eras and systems, one from a world where British power ruled the seas, the other from a world where money moved faster than law and sovereignty could be purchased with the right deposits. The U.S. government had more success with Skok's other prized possession. In August 2022, federal prosecutors obtained a warrant for the seizure of his Airbus A319 private jet, valued at $90 million. The aircraft, registered in Aruba, had been used by Skok to travel across Europe and Asia. But unlike the yacht, the jet couldn't hide in Dubai indefinitely. It needed to move, to land at airports, to enter jurisdictions where U.S. law had teeth. Prosecutors alleged that Skok had violated sanctions by using U.S. dollars to pay for the aircraft is registration fees and maintenance, transactions that were prohibited under the 2018 sanctions designation. The warrant authorized seizure anywhere the aircraft could be found. To date, the jet has not been seized, suggesting that SCOC has been careful to keep it in friendly territory. But the warrant's existence created a new constraint. Any flight that might take the aircraft through airspace controlled by U.S. allies carried risk. A flight to Europe could result in a forced landing and seizure. Even a refueling stop in the wrong country could be dangerous. The $90 million jet had effectively become a $90 million paperweight, useful only for flights within a shrinking radius of safe destinations. The yacht faced no such constraints. It never needed to move. Dubai offered everything: world-class facilities, excellent weather most of the year, privacy, and absolute protection from U.S. law enforcement. Madame Gu could sit at her berth indefinitely, a permanent resident of Mina Rashid. Marina maintained an operational waiting for the day when sanctions might be lifted or when SCOC might decide to risk a voyage to another safe harbor. In January 2026, vessel tracking data showed Madame Gu still in port at Dubai, her position logged at 25.26253 degrees north, 55.28298 degrees east. Her speed was recorded as 0 knots. She hadn't moved in nearly 4 years, but she was alive, her systems running, her crew aboard, her owner technically compliant with the letter of U.S. sanctions law by avoiding any U.S.-connected transactions, while simultaneously thumbing his nose at the spirit of those sanctions. For U.S. officials, Madame Gu represents both a failure and a learning opportunity. The failure is obvious. Despite unprecedented sanctions, despite a global coalition, despite diplomatic pressure on a close ally, they have been unable to touch this yacht or the dozens of others like it scattered across safe harbors from Dubai to the Maldives to Singapore. The sanctions designation was supposed to be a death sentence. Instead, it was an inconvenience. But the learning opportunity is valuable. The case has exposed the fundamental weakness in the sanctions regime. Economic pressure only works if there are no alternatives. As long as countries like the UAE are willing to accept Russian money and protect Russian assets, oligarchs will simply move their wealth to those jurisdictions. Sanctioning individuals without being able to seize their property creates a category of untouchable wealth, visible but unreachable, mocking the very concept of accountability. Some U.S. officials have proposed secondary sanctions, penalties that would target UAE companies and banks that service sanctioned Russian clients. But this is a nuclear option that would damage the U.S.-UAE relationship, possibly irreparably. Others have suggested working through international organizations to create global standards for sanctions enforcement. But this requires cooperation from countries like China and India that have explicitly refused to join Western sanctions. The reality is that in a multipolar world, sanctions only work against countries and individuals with nowhere else to go. For those with options, with wealth and mobility, sanctions are increasingly ineffective. Andrei SCOC himself has remained largely silent through the entire saga. Unlike some oligarchs who have protested their designations publicly or filed lawsuits challenging sanctions, SCOC has kept a low profile. He continues to serve in the Duma, voting as directed. He continues to appear in Forbes' rankings of Russian billionaires, his wealth estimated at between $6 billion and $9 billion depending on commodity prices. And he continues to own, through various corporate structures, 30% of Metallo Invest, one of the world's largest iron ore and steel producers. His voting record in the Duma tells the story of absolute loyalty to the Kremlin. When Putin needed support for recognizing the separatist regions, SCOC voted yes. When Putin needed support for the invasion itself, framed as a special military operation, SCOC voted yes. When Putin needed support for annexing occupied Ukrainian territory in sham referendums, SCOC voted yes. Every measure, every resolution, every bill that the Kremlin wanted, SCOC supported. This perfect record of obedience is what keeps him secure. As long as he remains useful to Putin, as long as he votes correctly and keeps his mouth shut, he will continue to enjoy his wealth. But there's a deeper story here, one that connects to SCOC's alleged past with the Solntsevskaya Bratva. The organized crime group that the U.S. Treasury claims SCOC once helped lead has evolved significantly since the 1990s. It's no longer just a criminal enterprise. It's intertwined with the Russian state, providing services that the government cannot officially perform and receiving protection in return. This symbiotic relationship between organized crime and the Kremlin is a defining feature of Putin's Russia. The line between mobster and minister, between racketeer and parliamentarian, has blurred to the point of invisibility. SCOC's trajectory from alleged crime boss to billionaire businessman to Duma deputy is not unusual in Russia. It's practically a template. The men who got rich in the chaos of the 90s often had criminal backgrounds or connections. Those who survived, who transformed their ill-gotten wealth into seemingly legitimate empires, did so by making themselves useful to Putin. Some provided muscle, others provided money. Some, like SCOC, provided political support, occupying seats in the Duma and voting however they were told. In exchange, They kept their wealth and their freedom as long as they remembered who was in charge. This is what makes Madame Gu more than just a yacht. It's a symbol of how power and money work in the modern world, how yesterday's gangster becomes today's legitimate businessman, how stolen wealth becomes respectably managed assets, how someone who should by any reasonable standard be treated as a criminal instead sits in a nation's parliament and ranks among its richest citizens. The yacht is evidence not of guilt, but of success. It proves that Scotch played the game correctly, that he understood the rules, that he made the right alliances and the right choices. And it proves that even when Western governments try to punish that success, they often fail. The workers who maintain Madame Gu, who climb aboard each morning to polish and paint and clean, probably don't think much about these larger questions. They have jobs to do. The yacht pays well. The work is steady. Whether the owner is a saint or a sinner is not their concern. But their labor, those buckets of cleaning solution and cans of paint, represent something profound. They represent the machinery that keeps kleptocracy functioning. Every service provider, every vendor, every employee who works for sanctioned oligarchs becomes, however unwittingly, part of the system that allows those oligarchs to maintain their lifestyles despite international condemnation. This is what U.S. officials mean when they talk about sanctions evasion. It's not just about moving money through shell companies or buying property in relatives' names. It's about the entire ecosystem of enablers, the lawyers and accountants and bankers and yacht crew, who make it possible for wealth to hide and function in plain sight. Breaking that ecosystem requires more than designations and press releases. It requires making it personally costly for individuals and companies to service sanctioned clients. But in a place like Dubai, where serving wealthy clients is the entire business model, that's easier said than done. As of January 2026, the diplomatic standoff continues. The U.S. Justice Department has not dropped its pursuit of Madame Gu, but neither has it achieved any progress toward actual seizure. The yacht remains in Dubai, maintained and operational. Andrei Skach remains in Moscow, serving in the Duma and managing his fortune. The UAE remains committed to its neutral position, welcoming Russian money while insisting it complies with all applicable international obligations. No one has won. No one has lost. The situation has simply frozen in place, a stalemate that could continue for years, but there are signs that the UAE's position may be slowly shifting. In February 2024, the Financial Action Task Force, an international body that sets standards for combating money laundering, removed the UAE from its gray list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring. This designation had been damaging to Dubai's reputation as a financial center, and Emirati officials worked aggressively to address FATF concerns about their anti-money laundering controls. Part of that work involved increased scrutiny of Russian transactions. While the UAE has not agreed to seize yachts or freeze oligarch accounts, it has quietly made certain transactions more difficult. Some Russian nationals have found it harder to open bank accounts. Some property purchases now face additional scrutiny. The changes are incremental and carefully calibrated to avoid spooking Russian clients, but they represent a recognition that harboring sanctioned wealth carries reputational costs. For Scotia, these shifts may eventually create new pressures. If Dubai becomes less welcoming, where does Madame Gu go next? The Maldives has been another favorite destination for sanctioned yachts, but the island nation has limited facilities and is vulnerable to international pressure. Singapore maintains strict financial controls and is unlikely to openly defy Western sanctions. Turkey, another option, has its own complex relationship with Russia and the West. The number of truly safe harbors is smaller than it appears and shrinking. There's also the question of utility. Madame Gu has now sat immobile for 4 years. She was built to sail, to cross oceans, to visit exotic ports. A yacht that never moves is just an expensive house that happens to float. At some point, the psychological value of owning her must diminish. Scotia could sell the vessel, though finding a buyer would be difficult with sanctions in place. He could scuttle her, though that would be a spectacular waste of wealth. Or he could simply abandon her, let her rot at the dock until creditors and authorities fight over who gets to claim the decaying hulk. None of these options are appealing, but all are more realistic than the fantasy that she might someday sail freely again. The other oligarchs whose yachts fled to Dubai face similar calculations. Vladimir Potanin's Nirvana has been there since June 2022. Andrei Melnichenko's motor yacht. A sits in Ras Al Khaimah, another Emirati port. These vessels represent billions of dollars in wealth, all frozen in place, maintained at enormous expense, serving no purpose except as symbols of their owners' inability to enjoy what they own. The prison is luxurious, but it's still a prison. Some context is necessary to understand why this matters beyond the fate of a few rich men and their toys. The sanctions regime against Russia is the most comprehensive economic warfare campaign in modern history. It's designed to isolate Russia economically, to make the war in Ukraine so expensive that continuing it becomes irrational. But sanctions only work if they're enforced. Every dollar that escapes, every asset that finds shelter, Every oligarch who maintains his lifestyle despite designations undermines the policy. It sends a message that the West's bark is worse than its bite, that with enough money and the right connections, you can ignore international pressure. Madame Gu is not a huge asset in the grand scheme of Russia's economy. $156 million is a rounding error in a conflict that has cost Russia hundreds of billions. But symbols matter. If the United States cannot seize a yacht that sits in a friendly country's harbor, if it cannot convince an ally to cooperate on something as straightforward as asset forfeiture, what message does that send about American power? What message does it send about the consequences of supporting Putin? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that American power has limits. Economic power, the ability to freeze assets and ban transactions, only extends as far as the willingness of other countries to cooperate. In a world where China offers an alternative financial system, where the Middle East has its own priorities, where Europe is divided and uncertain, those limits are becoming increasingly apparent. The sanctions on Russia have hurt, certainly. The ruble has crashed. Inflation has soared. Access to Western technology has been cut off, but Russia has not collapsed. Putin has not been overthrown. The war continues, and oligarchs like Skach still sleep on silk sheets aboard their superyachts. Inconvenienced but far from destroyed. There is a darker possibility. Perhaps the sanctions were never meant to work, at least not in the sense of actually seizing assets or forcing regime change. Perhaps they were theater, a way for Western governments to be seen doing something without having to do the hard work of actual enforcement. It's easier to issue press releases about frozen assets than to engage in the difficult diplomacy necessary to actually recover those assets. It's easier to declare yachts as blocked property than to confront allies about their role in sanctions evasion. The optics of action matter more than the reality of results. If that's true, then Madame Gu is not evidence of failure. She's evidence that the system is working exactly as designed. The U.S. gets to point at her and say, look, we've designated this Oligarch's Yacht. We're tough on Russia. The UAE gets to welcome the yacht and say, look, we're neutral and business-friendly. Everyone is welcome here. Scotch gets to keep his yacht and say, look, I'm smarter than the sanctions. They can't touch me. Everyone gets what they need from the arrangement. Everyone except the people of Ukraine, whose suffering continues while the world plays these games. The yacht workers who showed up that October morning, who climbed aboard with their cleaning supplies and paint, probably didn't think about any of this. They saw a job, a paycheck, a beautiful vessel that needed maintenance. They did their work professionally and well. At the end of the day, they went home to their families. The next morning, they came back and did it again. This is how systems perpetuate themselves, not through grand conspiracies or master plans, but through ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, following incentives, avoiding trouble, asking no questions that don't need to be asked. As of January 2026, Madame Gu remains in Dubai. Her blue hull still gleams in the sun, her teak decks are still immaculate, her crew of 36 still reports for duty, and somewhere in Moscow, Andrei Skach still serves in the State Duma, voting as instructed, maintaining his low profile, protecting his fortune. The yacht that was supposed to be seized sits untouched. The oligarch who was supposed to be punished remains wealthy and free. The ally that was supposed to cooperate continues to harbor Russian wealth. And the sanctions that were supposed to work have become, in this case at least, an expensive exercise in futility. This is the story of Madame Gu, the $280 million yacht that escaped FBI seizure by hiding in the one place American power cannot reach, the harbor of a friendly nation that has decided that friendship has its limits. It's a story about wealth and power, about law and sovereignty, about the gap between what governments say they will do and what they can actually accomplish. And it's a story that remains unfinished, frozen in place like the yacht itself, waiting to see whether diplomacy, economics, or time will eventually force a resolution. For now, the only certainty is that every morning workers will arrive at Mina Rashid Marina, climb aboard with their buckets and brushes, and maintain in pristine condition a vessel that represents everything Western sanctions were supposed to prevent.